Okay, Patty, why don't you come on up? Let's give Patty a big hand.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here this evening. I'm not used to having lights or a camera or this microphone like this, so hopefully I'm not going to make a fool of myself. It's all being recorded. My name is Patty Robinson, and I was asked to come here tonight to tell you a little bit about what is going on with our new League of Women Voters chapter that we have created here in the Santa Clarita Valley. But before I do that, I want to tell you a little bit about who I am and then put this within the context of a larger social issue, and particularly the mobilization of women during the early 1800s to the early 19th century, because that's going to give you an idea of how the League of Women Voters actually came about. Many of you in the audience, you've all heard of the League of Women Voters. You know what they do. You probably have an idea that, oh, yes, they deal with politics, they deal with nonpartisanship, they help get out the vote, all of these kinds of things. But they are only one of many organizations that formed or mobilized during the 1800s into the early 20th century. And I want you to understand this historical context. But before I do that, who am I? Well, my name is Patty Robinson. I'm from College of the Canyons. I've been at the college now almost 20 years. I was hired as a sociology instructor. I became chair of the department. I went on to go into administration for about 10 years. After 10 years of serving as dean, I really had reached a point in my life where it's like, you know, I really like my job, I like who I work with, I love what I do, except there's something missing. And that something missing was this big component of how can I give back? It's one thing to be looking at enrollment figures every day and thinking about how you can make the college better with regard to getting students in classes and all those kinds of things, but I really wanted to do something more. I wanted to go back to my academic roots. I wanted to become a sociologist again. I wanted to get students actively involved in what I saw as being a real problem in our society. Voter apathy, kids not being interested in volunteering, kids not joining groups, kids not getting involved in things like my generation or your generation. And maybe that was just silly on my part, because obviously we are coming from different generations, but I do see this lack of apathy. And so when I see these kinds of photographs that you were showing of people getting involved and doing something, and doing because they want to give back, that is where I was coming from. And I read a very important document called A Crucible Moment. And this document is available online if you just Google A Crucible Moment. And it talks about how higher education is at a turning point. We are actually at a point of having a paradigm shift. We have the opportunity to try and educate students now to become involved in civic literacy, awareness, and really to become aware of what they have to do in order to make our democracy thrive. If we take a look at what is happening right now in our country, our democracy is not doing well. And the reason being is that people are sort of turning their heads. They're walking away. They don't feel that it's their problem. They have become spectators. And in some cases, people would say we we are experiencing what is called a civic recession. We really don't have the kind of interest and input from all of our citizenry as we once did. And this has become especially true for young people. And so part of what we have to do is to reinvigorate that kind of idea of getting kids involved. We have to reinvigorate getting everyone involved, and part of this comes through the community college, because we are democracy's colleges. And so this goes back then to my own academic roots as a sociologist and what I studied when I was in graduate school. And I became very, very interested in women's organizations or voluntary associations. And so my work concentrated on this idea of how women were able to mobilize literally thousands and thousands and thousands of women across the country to do good work. At the same time, men were also organizing. And they were also getting people to do good work. They were stewards of their communities. And so I've kind of come full circle. That was 30 years ago when I did this work. And now I'm looking at it going, I'm back to it. I have returned to my academic roots. And what I want to do today, before I tell you a little bit about the League of Women Voters, I want, again, to put it within this context of how did this all happen. And so I'm here to tell a bit of a story, and that story has to do with what we call the women's club movement. This club movement in American history existed from 1800 to about 1920. 1920 should be that magical date that goes off in all of your heads, the year that women received the right to vote. Well, that right to vote didn't happen necessarily just because of the suffragettes. There was a whole nother group of women out there that were working very, very hard to bring about this kind of action for political reform, social reform, and they were not suffragettes. In fact, most of them did not agree with suffrage, and that's the story that I want to tell you for just a few minutes. All of you know that in the early American time, particularly from 1800 on, we were seeing tremendous social change happening in this country. Social change creates many social problems, and you've got to have an infrastructure set up to take care of those social problems, just like we see today. Unfortunately, we were a fledgling nation, and we did not have the same kind of infrastructure that we have today. We did not have a strong federal government. We did not have community municipalities. We did not have the kinds of local government, state government, national government that we see today that will, in fact, take care of these problems. And so when we look at the number of issues and problems taking place in the early 1800s, associations formed. These associations formed because they had to take care of these problems. You and I of that period had to be the ones to try and bring about social change because, again, we could not rely on our government. That government was not there yet, that infrastructure. So during this period, we became what de Tocqueville called a nation of joiners. We, as a society, were joining and forming all kinds of associations or voluntary associations where people came together to bring about change. De Tocqueville was a French, I can't talk, see, that's his thing right in front of me. He was a French scholar, and he came to America, and he was incredibly impressed by what was happening in our country, because this was truly an American invention. The idea of Americans joining together in their communities, large and small, and trying to bring about social change, this was something that was not happening in Europe. It was truly an American phenomenon, and it was truly an emphasis and an outcome of democracy. As a result, these particular kinds of associations were forming all over the place. Women were joining associations, men were joining associations. Many of these organizations exist today. We are holding this meeting in one of those that actually represents one of those organizations that formed during this period, the Moose. We had the Elks, we had the Seroptimists, we had Zonta, we had the Lions, we had the Masons, we had the Assistance League. We had all kinds of organizations that started forming in the 1800s all the way into the early 20th century. Why? They joined people together to solve social problems. Women were especially involved in this because many of these issues that were affecting American society were affecting women, particularly in their homes and particularly their families and children. And so one of these particular larger movements, if you will, was what was termed the Women's Club Movement. The Women's Club Movement specifically honed in on the interest of primarily middle-class, bourgeois, white women. These were women who were coming from means. They had money. But at the same time, they took their roles very, very seriously. While their husbands were out in the the public sphere, they were in the private sphere of their homes. They were coming from different places. They were in charge of their families, of their children. And in fact, just as these bourgeois women were forming, you also had women from different races, different classes, different religions also forming voluntary associations. But many of those groups were focused on other issues outside of the home. They were considering or looking at issues of labor, issues dealing with race. Those were other women. Again, all trying to bring about social change based on what was of interest to them as women. But when we're talking about the club women, they started out in what were called literary clubs. And many of you have heard of these. The poetry clubs, the history clubs, the reading clubs. The women that would gather, and many people would kind of poke fun and say, oh, they're just sitting there reading poetry. Oh, they're just reading, Shakespeare. Oh, well, they're not doing anything. But in fact, these women were very smart because what they were doing, they were following the trappings of college and university life. And understand that most of these women at the time could not go to college. But what they did is that they took from this college experience the reading, the writing, the speaking, learning the oratory skills, learning how to advocate, learning how to speak in front of groups, learning how to organize, how to facilitate meetings. They were learning all those kinds of skills that were going to help them later as women started to organize and mobilize in their groups. These women emphasized the virtues of being women. They, in fact, liked the idea of being put on a pedestal. They liked the idea of having their private sphere. They, in fact, believed they were morally superior to men, and they also believed that the home was their domain, and in order for the home to be reflective of the community, it was up for them, or up to them, to make sure it was protected. If you were going to have a good community, you needed to have a good home. You needed to take care of family and children. And so many of these women found this to be their moral duty and responsibility. If they were going to make sure their communities were safe for their kids, they needed to make sure their homes were safe. And so what they did is that they worked through their husbands. These women were not dumb. They knew that they could get more mileage working through their husbands in the public sphere, but yet still protect the private sphere. And these women were referred to as domestic feminists. They, in fact, were engaging in what was called municipal housekeeping. It was a time of tremendous social problems, as you all know, if you go back historically. And these women tackled all kinds of issues that, again, we did not have an infrastructure to tackle. Everything from child labor to juvenile justice to conservation to literacy and the building of libraries to city beautification to the creation of juvenile courts to creating kindergartens to emphasizing family planning, issues of sanitation, and also getting rid of drink and prostitution. That's what came out of these women. Again, they did not have the right to vote, but they had the power of who they were as domestic feminists. They worked through what we call a federated model. They had this model that started to at the national level. In other words, they formed at the national level, whereby they started to trickle down to states, to counties, to cities, to little townships. And this idea of a federation or a federated model played out very, very well when they needed to mobilize quickly to take care of social problems that were happening in the country. And as the nation started to become more and more developed, and particularly by the late 1890s, these women had formed into a large federated network called the Generation of Federated Clubs. These women were ready to mobilize. They still did not support suffrage. The suffragettes, in contrast to the League, or excuse me, to the Generation of Federation of Women's Clubs, represented only about 60,000 women in this country. The General Federation of Women's Clubs, those domestic feminists that were oftentimes criticized as being way too conservative, represented over 2 million women. Ironically, these women were the ones who, through their support and got women mobilized during World War I when we had an agricultural shortage. So in contrast to World War II, when we had Rosie the Riveter that went into industry, we had the Women's Land Army. And many of you are probably scratching your heads going, I've never heard of this. That's for another time, because next time Lois Baccio and I will show up here, and we've got a great PowerPoint presentation that we're going to show you. But nevertheless, what was happening by about 1909 and then thereafter, the suffragists, again, did not have as much power, but the women's club movement did. But what was happening is much of the work that women had been doing in their clubs was now starting to be co-opted by men and being co-opted by governments that were now starting to form. So the women's clubs that had been so powerful with regard to bringing about issues of sanitation, juvenile courts, all these kinds of things that they had been doing were now being co-opted, as I said, by men or these kinds of bureaucratic agencies. The General Federation of Women realized that they were going to lose out if they didn't now support suffrage. So it was only after they realized this, and just before 1919, that the women's club movement finally said, we support suffrage. If those women had not swung their support to the suffrage movement, the right to vote probably would not have passed, but it did vote, or did pass. So, women now have the right to vote. Everybody would think, yay, good for that. Well, big problem. Women had never voted before. Women didn't know how to get out there and be political actors. Women didn't know anything about lobbying. They had done all they had done as feminists, domestic feminists, but now they had to work within this political structure, and they had no way of really knowing how to do that. And so, ironically enough, it was just 6 months before the passage of the 19th Amendment that the League of Women Voters formed. And it was considered a mighty political experiment, and it came out of the roots of the suffrage movement. Unfortunately, as I said, the women of the time, they didn't have the tools to create a politically based infrastructure. They didn't know how to vote, they didn't know how to get candidates, they didn't know how to do all the kinds of things that we know how to do today, because this was such a male sphere. It had been part of that public sphere. However, these women started to look at this as new opportunities to bring about social change. They knew, in some cases, they had achieved their goal. And in some cases, these women walked away while others went into the labor market or the labor force, because women were now starting to enter into other aspects of life. You still had that need, though, to get women to go forward with this idea of being actively involved in politics. And so as a role of the League of Women Voters, and its goal was to educate women about voting, about lobbying, and understanding how to reform through legislative processes, because this was something women had no idea how to do. Today, the League of Women Voters continues to be nonpartisan. That was its goal and its mission from the very beginning. Its slogan, making democracy work. These women, way back when, and even today, look at this and say, our mission is to make democracy work. Democracy is an amazing thing that we have that is so indicative of American society, and we have to make it work. Everybody needs to play a part. It focused on a federated model, just like the General Federation of Women's Clubs, from the top, generating or going down, let's say, through those federations, to states, to counties, to townships. That is how the League of Women Voters started out. And in 1924, it had chapters in 346 of the 433 congressional districts. It stayed focused on federation. However, in time, it started to realize it was important to let local chapters really formulate and designate and determine what were their own interests. And so that's what you see today. The League, while it still exists at the national level, when you start to look at the local chapters, it really becomes focused on the needs of those regions or those townships or those particular chapters. It has remained solely a female membership until 1973. So even though it is referred to as the League of Women Voters, it is certainly open to men. And so why do we need a league, and why did we create a league? Well, a group of us in the community started talking about this almost a year ago, and we said, you know, it's interesting that nothing like this exists in Santa Clarita. We need to bring people together. We need to start looking at local issues. If we start looking specifically among the groups and many millennials, we see that rates of voting are down. The political participation right now is awful. The rates of voluntarism are at the lowest we've ever seen them in this nation. The idea of bringing people together in associations for what's called social capital is down lower than it's ever been. So when we talk about the Lions Clubs, we talk about all those kinds of voluntary associations, the associations that my parents joined left and right when I was a kid and I saw this, many of them just have fledgling memberships today. They're struggling. At the same time, the knowledge of U.S. government, history, and related topics is at an all-time low. We also see that there's been this total decline in interest in democracy as well as participation. We also see that there's what's called a civic opportunity gap. That when we look at people coming from underserved populations in this country, many of these people don't even know the first thing about getting involved in politics or the political process. And that relates then to the question where we have to ask ourselves, are we really a true democracy? Because are we really representing everyone in our country? So you can see we've got a lot of work to do. And at the same time, we have people who've just lost all interest in social issues. And we've also seen that there is a loss of our place as a world leader in the entire world. And so these things certainly concern me. I think they concern all of us. And so we have to look at how we can start emphasizing civic literacy and knowledge and awareness and concern. And how do we get people to start thinking about the public good? How do we get people to be like those two guys in the pictures there? That it's not about me, it's about us. And how do we get people, again, to emphasize public work? How do we get people excited about working for nonprofits? How do we get people interested in serving others? How do we get people to become encouraged to serve for action? And this is a big kind of challenge, but we all have to start stepping up to the plate. And certainly for women, we are an integral force. And so when we look at the League of Women Voters for Santa Clarita Valley, we as a group specifically talked about what would be our mission, and we came up with 3 areas. First of all, understand we are completely nonpartisan. We are not representing Democrat, Republican, whatever party. We are not emphasizing one candidate over another. But what we are emphasizing, and what we feel is so incredibly important to get out to our community, is that we need to emphasize civic literacy of history and government. We need to emphasize civic knowledge and awareness of processes. And we need to emphasize civility and social responsibility as related to citizenship, because we are all in this together. And so I hope you will consider joining our group. I brought some applications that you can actually send in to the League if you would like to join, and I can tell you more about the membership costs. They're on the form that I brought. But I'm going to open it up for any questions if any of you would like to ask me anything. And as I said, Lois and I are going to be coming back with our formal PowerPoint that we've got photos and everything that we'll share with you. Any questions? When do we meet? That's a very good question. Right now we've been meeting not on a consistent date. We will be meeting again this coming Monday, but we are in the process of getting our schedule formalized. We're working on a website, and so once we have all of that, our meeting times are going to be completely consistent. We've held several events thus far, and we're actually looking to partner with folks, so we'd love to partner with you on any kind of future events. And then also certainly my role at the campus, I'm faculty director of our Civic and Community Engagement Initiatives program. So part of what I'm doing, obviously, is really making those contacts with the community as well. So we really can be this bridge between what I like to say town and gown, where you're bringing the community into the campus and vice versa.
I was very interested in what you were talking about as far as people leaving the dialogue and the process. And the one thing that I've noticed more so in the last few years than anything else is how crude the conversations get when, and I'm not going to pick on either side, but you try to have a rational discussion about a particular item, and you're blasted back with vulgar comments and things that have nothing to do with what you're talking about. And so I think that there's also an issue of individuals that just don't care to participate in that anymore. And I'm just wondering, as the college programs are concerned, what we're doing to educate our college students about the ways to communicate in a meaningful and respectful way.
And that's a really good question. And one of the things I can tell you that we've been actively working on, there are 2 things. In fact, the college has just worked with several community members. We just submitted a small grant called Civility Matters. And if, in fact, we're awarded this grant, which will be coming through the California Humanities, our goal is to create a Civility Matters campaign for our community, not only for the college, but to reach out to businesses, places of faith, schools, and actively start to emphasize and come up with a plan of action in all of these different locations of how do we create civility, because we have lost this idea of civility, of civil discourse, and of mutual respect. And so that is one thing that we're really looking at. The second that you were topic that you said, as far as like just the conversation, you are correct, and it just is so discouraging whenever I listen to the radio or I turn on the television and people just shout at each other. They just kind of bark at each other. There's no dialogue going on. And so one of the things that we've done on campus, and this has to do with some training that took place at the Kettering Foundation in Ohio, we have brought the concept of deliberative dialogue to campus. Now, deliberative dialogue is just one type of public communication or public talk. There are all kinds of ways that you can engage in civil discourse, but deliberative dialogue is one. It's a very structured kind of a process whereby you actually look at a topic, you frame it. So in other words, you have to do a lot of research, you frame the topic, you come up with 3 basic options. And so when you bring people together to talk about this topic or this question, you have framed it in such a way that you also set up ground rules. So we are going to look at this topic. We have ground rules. You have to be respectful of each other. You have to allow each other to talk, and you have to be able to accept differing opinions. And part of how this works, and it may sound kind of silly, but it does work, is that you start to at a place where it comes from the values. So the idea is that you can have a room full of many different folks coming from very different perspectives, whether it's racial, ethnic, political, whatever it is. You start to find out where they're coming from and why they may feel the way they do when you start to examine these particular 3 options regarding this overall topic. And what it allows for is that by the end, after a lot of civil dialogue, while we still may not agree, we've reached common ground. We can at least see what we do agree on. And so finding that common ground then allows you to build from that point. So you haven't debated, you haven't discussed, you have dialogued. And dialogue is a very, very effective way of public talk. And this is something that we're working very hard on our campus to really get out there and get students and faculty trained in.
The last meeting that I went to at the college, it was a discussion about all the propositions that are usually like mud. And some of the ladies had gone somewhere and learned everything they possibly could about one of or their proposition, pro, con, everything. They rotated through the tables, so we got immersed in everything that we ever wanted to know and more about all of the propositions in a non-biased way. Mm-hmm. At my table, there was a student who'd just been there for 2 weeks from Asia, and he was taking copious notes, and he was so excited about what was going on and how much he was learning about America and the process and everything. And of course, I was pushing the websites to him when they would talk about something and they'd say, well, it's on the web, and I'd reach over and I'd go, you want to write this down? And I'd tell him where he should go. And another point, I went to the Lilac Festival up in Pine Mountain, and I stopped at the voting booth, and I said, hi, do you guys have any type of League of Women Voters chapter in Bakersfield or anything up here that you go to? And this gal said, no, why? And I told her one was forming down here, and she said, oh, please get me on the email list. She said, I would love to drive down all the way from Pine Mountain for a meeting. So that tells you right there that, you know, there's a gazillion people in our valley that won't have to drive that far.
And there is interest, and not only have we done the ballot, we called it Cookies and Conversation, if I remember correctly, and we will be doing more, and several of the members of our league did go to almost a day-long training where they were very much skilled or trained by skilled women in the league, many of whom have been in the league in the Los Angeles chapter for decades, and really helped us bring this information to disseminate back. Also, with regard to another event that we did, we had Chris Carson, who is the national president of the League of Women Voters. This we had her come to COC last October Chris Carson, again, national president, lives here in Los Angeles, so has been extremely supportive of what we're doing. And then one other thing that we were able to, kind of back to the idea of the dialogue, we actually ran a sort of scaled-down version of a deliberative dialogue, and the topic was the America we want to be. And it was really, really interesting to hear what came out of that discussion. So these are the kinds of things that we are only going to continue to do more of. And as I said, we're happy to partner with other organizations, and certainly we are partnering with the college, and particularly with our Center for Civic Engagement. Any other questions?
Let's give Patty a big hand.
Thank you very much. And I will
Well, thank you, Patty.